Welcome to Borders and Belonging, a podcast that explores issues in global migration and aims to debunk myths about migration based on current research. This series is produced by CERC Migration and Democracy. I'm Maggie Perzyna, a researcher with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University. Global temperatures rise. Vulnerable areas around the world are facing environmental disruptions and extreme weather events. Challenges like floods, droughts, and deforestation are causing a fundamental shift in the daily lives of many in the global south. These kinds of environmental shifts are forcing people from their homes and livelihoods, creating climate-related migration. Today, we're exploring the idea of a climate refugee. It's a popular term in the media, but is such terminology accurate? Two researchers will help us unpack the catchy phrase and guide us through some of the nuanced intersections between the environment and migration. But first, we'll hear from Daniela Paredes Grijalva. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna and a member of the Global D Center. In 2019, Daniela was on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a place where, just months earlier, a strong earthquake had caused a tsunami and a rare phenomenon called soil liquefaction. The consequences were absolutely devastating.
In February 2019, the death toll had been over 4,000 and over 170,000 people were displaced. Financial losses, which are obviously also difficult to calculate, but they surpassed the $1 billion mark. The homes of 60,000 families were severely damaged or destroyed. Well, in short, it was a terrible time for the people of Sulawesi, especially central Sulawesi.
Daniela wanted to learn about how these disasters impacted mobility on the island. She wondered who left, who stayed, and why. So as part of her research, she interviewed a wide range of people.
I started talking to humanitarian and development workers in Indonesia that had been involved in the post-disaster response. I was trying to understand the logics with which these organizations operated on the ground, to try to identify if this intersection of environment and human mobility was something that they were doing explicitly or not.
The more Daniela spoke with different actors, the more she realized that many organizations had very specific ways of describing who their beneficiaries were. For example, some would refer to them as disaster victims, but Daniela quickly learned that these kinds of terms did not always reflect how Sulawesi residents described their own experiences. So she kept asking questions.
During one of my interviews, I kept on asking about, well, what about this term? And this is obviously a limitation, or more than a limitation, the angle with which I was coming, right? From university, I want to have my categories clear. What words am I talking about? What concepts? So I kept on asking, what about refugee? What about displaced person? What about internally displaced? What about international migrants? What words are you using in your work? And I did end up annoying the person on the other side. And they got back to me saying, regular people, just regular people.
This response prompted Daniela to think more deeply about how environmental disasters are just one of many challenges people face. And it was an important reminder on how the environment intersects with other fundamental human rights.
In these interactions, I heard of people who hadn't registered births or marriages, and because of that reason could later not make any claims to disaster compensation or participate in relocation programs. That seems like a pretty basic or fundamental thing that also needs to be addressed. And I think that's a good reminder for those of us working in this field of environmental migration. Yes, it's a specialized field. At the same time, I guess the challenge is, how do we connect it to basic human rights?
Just as important a lesson for Daniela while being on the ground in Sulawesi was the fact that many people preferred to stay and self-organize to mitigate their circumstances. Their approaches to dealing with the disasters were often different from that of aid organizations.
It's common in post-disaster responses to bring in tents and build camps. When I talked to communities that self-organized, they did not build tents. What they did was go to the forest and gather natural materials that were available to them, that they were familiar with, and that were, relatively light in case of aftershocks or other earthquakes, and left enough space for people they didn't cramp people into a single camp. That was not the logic, right? Oftentimes people decided to go back to the same and build these temporary shelters from materials they've gathered in the forest, exactly in the same place or not too far away from their destroyed home, because that was their land. They had attachment to that land.
Seeing how many local residents responded also ran contrary to the media narrative that those impacted by climate disasters want to go to the global north.
Talking to people at different islands of Indonesia, I rarely encountered people who, after traumatizing disasters like earthquakes, wanted to actually leave the country.
Many thanks to Daniela Paredes Grijalva for sharing her experience in Sulawesi with us. Here to help us separate the myths from the facts surrounding climate-induced migration is Dr. Kathleen Hermans, head of the Mixo-Co Research Group at Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany. Her work looks at the links between environmental change and human migration in the tropics. And Robert McLeman, Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies, Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada, and Policy Advisor on the effects of climate change and global migration patterns. Thanks to you both for joining me. People love a catchy phrase, and the term climate refugee seems to have taken root. What exactly does the term refer to? Robert, let's start with you.
So the term refugees is an old word. It goes back hundreds of years, and historically it meant anybody who simply migrated because they had no other choice, but they had to migrate. After World War II, that term actually became codified in the United Nations Convention about Refugees, which said that under international law, a refugee is someone who is forced to leave their home and cross an international border because of persecution, violence, or other factors like that. So we have this international definition of what a refugee is. When people start to use the term environmental refugee or climate refugee, they're implying people who must leave their homes because of typically natural disasters or extreme storm events or floods or things like that. But it's more of a lay term that really doesn't fit under international law.
Kathleen, do you think climate refugee is a useful term?
The term climate refugee supports a narrative that climate migration is kind of a crisis and a phenomenon. This largely originated in the global south and poses a burden on the global north, if not even a threat to the global north. So in that sense, I don't really consider it as a very useful term. It plays with the fear of people. And also the scientific evidence for all this is lacking, which makes it actually quite kind of misleading.
The UN has terminology to define who a refugee is. Do you think climate refugee should be added to their definition?
There's a challenge that we face right now in the sense that we have a definition of what constitutes a refugee. There's a UN convention about it. And in theory, the international community is obliged to protect people who are displaced because of violence and conflict. But we do a very, very poor job of doing so. There are millions of refugees in places like Kenya and Turkey and all around the Middle East, people who meet the existing refugee definition, but they are not receiving protection. They are not being resettled. They're not receiving any assistance whatsoever from the international community. So I think, like a lot of people, I hesitate when people say, well, let's expand the definition of a refugee to include this new class of people who must move from their homes because of environmental reasons. The question I have is, are the resources going to be put into place to allow these people to be resettled, to receive protection if they need to relocate? Until I see more progress on the existing refugee population around the world, which right now is, estimates range from anywhere from 30 to 60 million people, depending on the circumstances. If we're doing such a poor job already, do we really want to create a new class of people if they're not actually going to receive that protection? And also the other thing to think about is that there are other options for dealing with this challenge as well. Maybe it's something that's better dealt with in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe it's something that's better dealt with in the context of the New York Convention on safe and orderly migration and refugee protection. There's a lot of different international policy tools that could be used and mobilized to help people who are exposed to climate-related risks better adapt, whether that means staying in place, whether that means moving. But I don't know if expanding the existing refugee convention definition is perhaps the best policy tool for doing so.
Well, I totally agree with what Robert says, and including a certain group of people into the convention or the definition of refugee automatically means also excluding some others, and this would potentially could potentially weaken the convention as such. An alternative approach on top of that, what Robert already mentioned, might be to come up with creating a new convention. It might be a very long process, and governments may not really want to engage in that.
What areas of the world are most likely to create environmental migrants, and why? Robert?
In one sense, we already know where environmental migrants are found. Each year, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva releases annual statistics on people who've been displaced from their homes by floods and droughts and storms and wildfires and so on. And each year, without fail, going back over the past decade, there's certain countries that are in the top 10. So we're talking about China, Vietnam, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and the United States. So without fail, large numbers of people each year are displaced from their homes by weather-related events that will be made worse by climate change. So in one sense, there's no mystery about where folks are being displaced. Plus, we have more episodic events. So, for example, in East Africa right now, there's a severe drought, and so a lot of people are being forced to migrate because of that. In Australia, a few years ago, we had people displaced from their homes by wildfires. In British Columbia, we had people displaced by floods 2 years ago. So we already know where these things are happening. So in one sense, the future is going to be a lot more people displaced in those countries by similar events. Added on to that is that sea levels are rising, and that increases the threat to coastal communities of extreme storms and storm surges and king tides and salinization of coastal land. And so there will be a lot of coastal areas that are also extremely exposed to the impacts of climate change. And this ranges from everything from small island states in the Pacific, where, everybody lives within a meter or two of sea level, to large states or large cities like Shanghai or Dhaka city in Bangladesh, which are large urban areas that are situated very close to sea level and are therefore exposed. So we're talking essentially about an upscaling of people on virtually every continent who are at threat of displacement because of climate change.
Kathleen, where are people going?
Most people, they stay within their own national borders. So they don't cross international borders. They don't travel long distances, but they stay close to the places where they actually live, at least as far as they are able to do so. So this entire misperception about people moving from the global southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere because climate change pushes them to do so, that's actually quite wrong. People stay where they prefer to stay, where they used to live.
In talking about environmental migrants, we mainly talk about those who are moving. What about those who are left behind, those who can't or don't want to move?
Well, indeed. I mean, if we talk about climate mobility, we also need to talk about immobility. And it's just a matter of fact that the majority of people remains in situ, also when facing climate change and climatic risk. So, for example, in one of our research climate adaptation strategy of nearly 10,000 rural households in sub-Saharan Africa drylands, we found that 1 in 4 households actually engages in migration as response to any sort of environmental change. This also means that 75% apply a variety of strategies to adapt to environmental changes, climate changes in situ. And this is mainly related to farming practices, natural resource management, and so on. So to me, the question is, why do people actually stay? And the reasons for this can actually vary extremely among people, but also communities. And as you already indicated, some people don't want to leave their homes because they are attached to the place where they live. Others don't leave because they have responsibilities at home and this restricts them to move. And then again, others, they want to leave, but they don't have the resources because they lack the money for the journey, migration is expensive, they suffer from bad health conditions, or they simply miss a social network that can support or advise them. And it's particularly this latter type of immobility, this involuntary immobility, that can be problematic because it can increase existing inequalities, it can create new ones, it can also intensify or create future vulnerabilities to climate change. So I think taken together, immobility and its reasons are just as diverse as mobility.
So yes, when we think about migration, I mean, we often are simply talking about the movement of people from point A to point B, but it's actually a much more complex system. So when people move, what they often do is they're moving for economic reasons or social or family-related reasons, as well as perhaps environmental reasons. And once they move, they often try to remit money home to loved ones who remain behind, and that money is reinvested to help strengthen the resilience of the household. In some cases, whole communities will rely on remittances to help build up their capacity to adapt to a changing climate or to changing economic conditions. And so the key thing to think about when we're talking about environmental migration is to look at it within the context of the wider economic system and the wider social systems that exist in places that are exposed to climate risk, because it's part and parcel of a larger process of adaptation.
What do you think is the biggest myth or misconception about climate-induced mobility?
Well, for me, the deterministic narrative that climate change leads to massive waves of migration, the so-called climate refugees, from the southern to the northern hemisphere, with entire regions or community being abandoned and people having no choice other than leaving. This, I think, for me, is probably the biggest misconception about climate-related migration. It's still very persistent, though. And this picture is often used and maintained both by left and right-wing parties to justify their own political programs and goals, and it can be strengthening border control regimes, or it can also be to push action towards climate protection, whatever it is, yeah.
I think one myth is that everybody, at least in Western countries, northern countries, seems to think that it happens to other people in other places. And I think that misconception is starting to change as more and more climate-related disaster events hit places like California and Vancouver and British Columbia and Western Europe and so on. But there's still this perception that it's happening to other people in other parts of the world, typically poor people in poor parts of the world, and that those of us who live in high-income countries can sort of, we can take our time and we don't really need to, it's not an urgent humanitarian crisis. When in fact, if we look at our own history here in North America, for example, during the 1930s, we had hundreds of thousands of people displaced by droughts during the Great Depression. As I've mentioned, we've had a number of extreme flood and storm events in recent years. We've had wildfires in California, and we're in the midst of a mega drought in southwestern United States right now, where water supplies are falling dangerously low in places like Phoenix, Arizona, Los Angeles, and other parts of the Southwest. And if those drought conditions don't ease in the next couple of years, there will be a water-related crisis. So I think that's the key thing that we need to dismiss with this myth that it happens only to poor people in poor countries.
Given what climate change is doing to the planet, global warming, drought, and rising sea levels, should governments start planning for more of this kind of migration?
Yes, absolutely. Anybody who thinks that in a climate disrupted future there's going to be less migration and less displacement is living in a fool's paradise. They're deluding themselves completely. And we see this already. Like I said, last year in 2022, almost 25 million people around the world were displaced from their homes by floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires. And those events are going to happen with greater frequency and intensity in a world where the climate has changed. And unless we get our greenhouse gas emissions under control, those numbers are only going to increase. So the question becomes, when do you start planning for this? And I was involved in a project a few years ago, just before the pandemic, where the governments for the cities of Seattle and Portland in the Western United States called in a group of experts. And essentially what they wanted to know was, when can we expect more migrants from the southwestern United States because of drought and water scarcity? And the reason they wanted to know now is that if they're going to have an increase in migrants arriving from the southwestern United States, they need to start building infrastructure now to accommodate these people. Things as mundane as electrical transmission towers and water treatment plants and sewage and so on, because it takes 20 to 30 years from the moment of conception to the actual rolling out of these large infrastructure projects to accommodate population growth. And so that's an example of a group of communities that are thinking ahead. But these are very localized examples, and I think and I hope that governments are starting to recognize that this is not some over-the-horizon problem. We are at the horizon. These things are already emerging. So again, the question becomes, how are we going to actually manage these population displacements and the desire to migrate created by climate change?
I totally agree with Robert, absolutely. So to me, the question is how this should or could happen. And as I just said, today national governments, they often seek reasons to justify a politics of closed borders or intensifying border control regimes to prevent these so-called climate refugees from entering their territories. And so climate migrants are viewed as a threat to national security, even though there is no substantial evidence to support this claim. So for me, a first important step would be to change the political discourse. So governments need to acknowledge that migration has always been a part of human behavior and it's not good or bad per se. So being mobile or becoming mobile can have both positive and negative effects on human well-being for both the sending and the receiving communities. And in addition to that, what Robert just mentioned or said, politics needs to listen to those who are directly affected by climate change and climate risks. And they need to listen to their needs. They need to listen to their imaginations of their own futures. And this sounds quite trivial, but it's hardly taken into account in national or international policies.
We've touched on policies a little bit. What measures need to be put in place now to help mitigate the difficulties environmental migrants face?
The first step is obviously the international community needs to actually act upon the international climate agreements, the Paris Agreement, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and get greenhouse gas emissions under control, because that's at the root cause of this. In terms of people, but even if we do act on climate change, and we are acting very slowly, there are going to continue to be people who want to move or who need to move because of climate change and its impacts. And so the wider narrative in Western countries in the last decade or so has been to look at migration generally, for whatever reason, as a problem that needs to be controlled, that needs to be limited. Every Western country, every high-income country is happy to receive migrants who are computer programmers or medical professionals and so on. But generally speaking, they are very reluctant to receive migrants in general, and certainly do not want to receive refugees or people who are displaced from other countries. And when those events happen, it's referred to as a migration crisis. And that mindset, regardless of why people are moving, that mindset needs to change. We have countries in North America, in Europe, in Asia, using military technologies, drones and surveillance tools, and often in many cases the military itself, to try and prevent people from moving across borders, and in some cases even within countries. And that mindset needs to change. We need to look at migration as something that, when it's done properly, and properly means giving migrants rights and protections the same as other people, when it's done properly, everybody tends to benefit, the receiving communities, the sending communities, the migrants themselves. When we try to control and restrict migration, what we do as governments is we force migrants into the hands of organized crime. We force them into dangerous behaviors, like clandestine border crossings and things like that. And they are never allowed to enter into the legal workforce. And so one of the things that I've emphasized in my own career is that migration is going to happen. What the challenge is what are the circumstances under which it's going to happen? Is it going to happen openly and regularly with rights and opportunities for all, or is it going to be done in the shadows? And when it's done in the shadows, that's when migration becomes a problem.
Kathleen, what do you think?
Well, I think in line with what we just discussed, I think there is no need for policies that aim to avoid climate-driven migration and closing borders for all the reasons that were just mentioned. I think the question to be addressed in policymaking should be, how can migration improve the well-being of populations that are affected by climate change? So, for example, last year, the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change was signed by a couple of nations from East Africa, including the Horn of Africa. And this declaration was or is considered a milestone that supports thinking in the direction of mitigating the difficulties that environmental migrants face. And the aim is to prioritize and to stimulate global support to deal with the impacts of climate change on human mobility. So this is all kept rather broadly, but it calls for greater cooperation between nations to adequately respond to the diverse consequences of climate change and migration. And of course, it remains to be seen how this declaration will be implemented in reality. But it sounds promising, and in principle, this is the way forward. So focus on cooperation, focusing on exchange, and focusing on learning from each other.
Looking to the future, how do you see us adjusting our behavior and adapting to a new climate reality?
It's a good question. We don't know what the future will bring. But given that climate change will intensify, there will be an increasing need to adapt to these changes, just as just mentioned, and likely this will also increase mobility. It's difficult, however, to predict human behavior and future migration dynamics for a couple of reasons related to assumptions, related to uncertainties, related to many aspects. And above all, human behavior and migration is not necessarily rational, and it can be quite counterintuitive. Still, I think, or still it is likely that some regions that are currently populated will become unsafe or perhaps even uninhabitable. So think about regions that are expected to experience climatic conditions which are similar to those that we currently find in the center of the Sahara only. Or think about densely populated, low-lying coastal areas that will be threatened by sea level rise. And in such situations, movement out of these regions or even planned relocations are quite a likely consequence, yes.
Unfortunately, I see us doing it reluctantly, slowly, and only in response to extreme events or crises. We've known about the risks of climate change for many decades now. We've known about the impacts that climate change has on communities, on households, on cities, on countries. The science has been very clear for many years what the risks are. And the social science has also been very clear for many years now, at least 15 to 20 years, about how people respond to climate risks and how institutions can either facilitate effective responses or how poor policies and poor institutional decisions restrict people's ability to adapt and can actually create situations where people are worse off. As a scientist, when I see the international community lurching so slowly forward on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, on implementing the sustainable development goals that we've agreed upon for several decades now, on trying to put into place reasonable policies and practices to deal with refugees and migrants, and it's moving so slowly at a time when the environmental changes that we're experiencing are happening at much faster paces. So unfortunately, I would like to be optimistic. It's always nice to get to the tail end of a podcast and say the future is rosy and that, we're on the right track and so on. I genuinely feel that our policymakers are not on the right track. And the only time they get on the right track is when there's been a crisis in their home country and they suddenly realize, oh my goodness, we need to do something. The way that we prevent people from being involuntarily displaced from their homes is to make them better able to adapt and cope with these changes. And part and parcel of that means making them less poor than they are today. If poor countries 50 years from now are no longer poor countries, we have gone a long way towards reducing a lot of the involuntary displacement risks that we're going to face. But conversely, if poor countries 50 years from now are still poor, we simply create humanitarian crises of the type that, quite frankly, we're not well equipped to deal with.
Given what you've shared with me, do you think anyone has the risk of becoming an environmental migrant?
I would not say that anyone has the potential to become an environmental migrant. I think everybody has the potential to experience loss or harm because of the impacts of climate change. I can't think of a single community where people live in some sort of wonderful bubble where the natural environment does not affect their well-being directly or indirectly. So, for example, perhaps someone who's fortunate enough to live in a community where there's rarely any sort of extreme weather events or, shortage of water or any sort of, limitation on natural resources. The reality is that our global economy is an interconnected one. So we have a drought in Australia, food prices rise in the Middle East. We have a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, food prices rise. We've seen this during the pandemic, supply chain disruptions on everything from automobile parts to microchips. So these sort of systemic interconnections within the economy means that even if you are fortunate enough to escape the direct impacts of climate change, you're never going to be immune from the larger societal and economic consequences of climate change.
Kathleen, do you have anything to add?
I mean, it's true that we are today talking about people leaving regions that were quite rich in the recent past and that were, for example, considered as being touristic hotspots, like talking about the Mediterranean regions here in Europe, and that we know now because of extended drought periods, of water scarcities, of extreme heat events, that people leave those regions. And of course, this comes together with a couple of other reasons for leaving, just as Robert mentioned. But it's certainly something that occurs and that we are talking about. I'm not going to say that everybody of us can be a potential climate migrant. But in principle, everybody who is highly exposed and sensitive to climate change and who has limited capacities to adapt in situ, in principle can become a climate migrant.
Thanks to Dr. Kathleen Hermans and Professor Robert McLeman for joining me today. And thank you for listening. This is a CERC Migration and Democracy podcast, produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe to Borders and Belonging on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on climate-induced migration, please visit the show notes. I'm Maggie Perzyna. Thanks for listening.